She waited 71 years to say it. And when she finally did, the words hit harder than anyone expected. Kara Knotts, the daughter of one of the most beloved comedians in American television history, has finally broken her silence. And what she revealed about her father, about his private pain, his hidden struggles, and his final moments on this earth, is something that will stay with you long after this video ends. So if you ever laughed at Barney Fife, if you ever loved the nervous little deputy who made the whole country smile, you need to hear this. Because the real story of Don Knotts is nothing like what you saw on screen. Most people remember Don Knotts as the jittery, bug-eyed, lovable deputy on the Andy Griffith Show. He made you laugh every single time he walked into a room. He won 5 Emmy Awards playing that role. 5. And to the outside world, he looked like a man who had everything. Fame, talent, a legacy that would never fade. But behind that nervous smile and those wide, panicked eyes was a man carrying wounds so deep that even his own daughter did not fully understand them until it was almost too late. Here is what Kara Knotts, now 71 years old, has finally found the courage to share. And trust us, by the time you reach the end of this video, you will see Don Knotts in a way you never have before. To understand the truth Karen revealed, you first have to go back to where it all began. Not to Hollywood, not to a television studio, but to a small, struggling home in Morgantown, West Virginia, where a little boy named Jesse Donald Knotts came into the world completely unwanted by the life that was waiting for him. His mother, Elsie, was already 40 years old when Don was born. His father, William, was a broken man, a farmer who had lost everything, slowly being swallowed by mental illness and alcohol. The family had just been forced to give up their farm. There was no warmth in that house. There was no safety. Don's father suffered from severe schizophrenia. And that is not just a word. That meant unpredictable, violent moments. That meant a little boy hiding in corners, terrified of the man who was supposed to protect him. Don later talked about times when his father came at him with a knife. Think about that for a moment. A child, growing up not knowing if today was going to be the day his own father hurt him. That kind of childhood does not leave you. It follows you for the rest of your life. And in Don Knotts' case, it shaped every single thing about him, including the nervous energy that made millions of people laugh. His older brothers were not much comfort either. They drank like their father. They were rough. But there was one brother Don loved more than anyone in the world. His brother Sid. Sid was the funny one. Even in the darkest moments, Sid could make the family laugh. For little Don, Sid was not just a brother. He was a lifeline. He was proof that laughter could survive anything. And then one day, Sid was gone. He died suddenly from a severe asthma attack. And Don Knotts, already a frightened and lonely child, lost the one person who made him feel like the world was going to be okay. What do you do when you are a scared little kid and the one person who made you feel safe is suddenly gone? For Don, the answer was a wooden dummy named Danny. He picked up that dummy and he started making people laugh himself. Not because it was easy, because it was the only way he knew how to survive. Comedy was not just a career choice for Don Knotts. It was armor. It was the thing he built between himself and a world that had already hurt him badly. He carried that armor with him when he left West Virginia as a teenager, moving to New York City with nothing but hope and a dummy tucked under his arm. The city slammed the door in his face. Casting directors looked at him and saw someone too awkward, too nervous, too strange. So he joined the army instead. And here is something most people do not know. Don Knotts served in World War II, traveling across the Pacific performing in variety shows to keep the spirits of soldiers alive. He made men laugh in the middle of a war. Think about what that says about him. Even at the worst moment in the world, Don Knotts found a way to bring a little light. After the war, he went back to school, earned a degree, fell in love with a woman named Catherine, and tried New York again. This time, slowly, painfully, things began to open up. Small radio roles, a soap opera, and then a spot on the Steve Allen Show, where he played a nervous, twitchy man being interviewed on television. Audiences went absolutely wild for it, because that character, that trembling, wide-eyed, overwhelmed little man, that was not just a performance. That was Don Knotts pouring his real self onto a screen and somehow making it funny. And then came the phone call that changed everything. In 1960, Don saw his old friend Andy Griffith preparing to launch a new television show. Don picked up the phone, called Andy, and said with a laugh that Andy was going to need a deputy and that it should be him. Andy made it happen, and Barney Fife was born. The character that would make Don Knotts one of the most celebrated comedians in the history of American television. 5 Emmy Awards. A household name. A legend. But here is the thing about armor. When you wear it long enough, it stops protecting you and starts suffocating you. What most fans never knew was that Don Knotts was suffering deeply throughout the years he was making them laugh the hardest. His anxiety was not just a character trait. It was a real, daily battle. Before live performances, he would sometimes be unable to get out of bed for days. The fear was that overwhelming. Doctors prescribed him anxiety medication in the 1950s. And like many people who desperately need relief, he became too dependent on those pills. On top of that, Don struggled with hypochondria, convincing himself he was physically ill when he was not, spending years trapped in a cycle of fear and imaginary sickness that made real life almost impossible to enjoy. His marriage to Catherine fell apart after 13 years. 2 children, including Karen, watched their parents drift further and further apart as Don's career demanded more and more of him. The man who made every American home feel warmer on Friday nights could not seem to hold his own home together. He later married again, and that marriage ended too. He faced a diagnosis of macular degeneration, the terrifying news that he was slowly losing his eyesight. He spiraled. He fought. He eventually had surgery that saved his vision. But the emotional damage was already done. Then came the cruelest blow of all. Years of smoking had quietly been doing damage that no surgery could fix. In the early 2000s, doctors told Don Knotts he had lung cancer. He had quit smoking more than a decade earlier. But it was too late. The disease had already taken hold. And this is the part where you begin to understand exactly what Karen has been carrying all these years. Don Knotts, even when he was dying, did not stop being Don Knotts. He protected his children from the full truth of how serious his condition was. He kept making jokes. He kept the room light. He kept performing right up until the very end, because that is all he had ever known how to do. Comedy was not just his gift. It was the only language he had ever fully trusted. Karen was by his side in those final days, and she has shared something that stops you cold when you hear it. Even as her father was dying, he found a way to make her laugh. She recalled that in his final hours, he said or did something so funny that she and her stepmother were both in absolute fits of hysterical laughter. And Karen, overcome with that laughter and overcome with grief at the same time, ran out of the room. She could not stand the idea of laughing in front of her dying father. It felt wrong. It felt disrespectful. So she left. And that decision has stayed with her every single day since. Because later, a director friend told her something that cracked her open. He said she should have stayed. He said that is what comedians live for. They do not want you to cry at the end. They want you to laugh. Karen agreed. She said she should have stood right there and burst out laughing, because that is exactly what her father would have wanted. That is the awful truth she has been sitting with for years. Not that her father suffered, though he did. Not that his life was hard, though it was. But that in his very last moment of comedy, his final performance, she walked away from the audience he needed most. And then there was Andy. Because no story about Don Knotts ends without Andy Griffith. The two men had drifted apart over the years, the way old friends sometimes do when life pulls them in different directions. But when Don was dying at UCLA Medical Center, Andy Griffith came. He sat by the bed of the man who could no longer speak. And Andy talked to him. He said the things that needed to be said. He told him he loved him. He called him by a name almost nobody knew, Jess. Because Don had once quietly told Andy that his real name was Jesse, a name he had always disliked. And Andy, being Andy, held on to that small private secret and used it in that final sacred moment. He said, "Keep breathing, Jess." And Don Knotts, unable to speak, moved his shoulders slightly. Just enough to say, I hear you. I am still here. That small movement. That is the moment that defines who Don Knotts really was underneath all the comedy and all the chaos and all the pain. A man who, even at the very end, was still reaching toward the people he loved, still trying to let them know he was there. Don Knotts passed away on February 24, 2006. He was 81 years old, and he left behind something far greater than 5 Emmy Awards or a beloved television character. He left behind a daughter who is still learning, even now at 71, what it means to have been loved by a man like him. A man who turned his deepest fears into the world's greatest laughter. A man who never stopped performing, because stopping would have meant facing the silence he had been running from since he was a little boy in a cold house in West Virginia, holding a wooden dummy and hoping that making someone laugh would somehow make everything okay. Karen Knotts has carried this story for a long time, and now that she has shared it, maybe the rest of us can finally see the real Don Knotts. Not just the deputy, not just the comedian, but the man, the father, the little boy who survived, who fought, who laughed, and who in the end gave everything he had to make sure the people around him felt a little lighter. If this story moved you, share it with someone who remembers Don Knotts. And tell us in the comments, what is your favorite memory of Barney Fife? Because that character, that nervous little man with one bullet in his pocket, deserved to be remembered. And so did the man behind him.